Ready for a deep dive into something that really makes you think. We've got a listener who's asking a pretty bold question. Is international trade really just a form of warfare waged against developing nations?
Mm.
We're going to try to answer that today. We're cracking open Trade is War by Yash Tandon to see what he has to say.
Now that's an interesting one. Tandon doesn't pull any punches. And what really struck me is how he uses his own life experiences, growing up and then later working as a negotiator for Uganda and Kenya at the WTO, to really back up his arguments.
Yeah, not your typical economist stuck in ivory tower theory.
Okay,
Right?
sorry.
Before we go any further, we got to talk about the endorsements on this book. I mean, you've got heavy hitters like Noam Chomsky and Vandana Shiva singing its praises.
Yeah, right from the get-go. It's a perspective that demands attention. Chomsky calls it, and I quote, a necessary and timely contribution, which, from him, is high praise indeed. And Shiva, who spent her life fighting for social justice and sustainability, she says that seeing trade through this lens of war is key for the Global South if they want to break free from exploitation.
Okay, so we're definitely not dealing with some fringe theory here.
Yeah.
Those endorsements tell me Tandon's onto something that deserves a serious look. But for those of us who haven't read the book yet, what's the core argument? Give me the elevator pitch.
At its heart, Tandon says the global trade system, and especially the WTO, it isn't really about free trade at all. He argues that it's a system that's been built, perhaps not intentionally, but built nonetheless to benefit those who already hold power. And it often comes at the expense of developing countries. It's almost like, in a way, a continuation of what we saw in the colonial era, just with different tools of exploitation.
So instead of warships and colonies, it's all about economic leverage and trade rules that are skewed to favor the powerful.
You got it.
Now, you mentioned Tandon's own background earlier. Where do his experiences fit into all of this?
Well, this is where it gets really fascinating. He makes this really thought-provoking comparison between the WTO and his own childhood in Uganda. He talks about growing up in what he called a headless society.
Hold on, headless society, that sounds kind of creepy. What does that even mean?
No need to worry, no zombies or anything like that. When Tandon says headless, he means a society without a central governing body calling all the shots. He describes it as this collection of different groups, each with their own customs and ways of resolving conflicts,
So kind of like a bunch of independent groups just trying to get along and coexist peacefully.
Exactly. And in this headless society, diplomacy was the name of the game. It was how they settled disputes, how they kept the peace. It was very different, he says, from how the WTO operates.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
So how does this headless society idea play onto Tandon's critique of the WTO?
Well, he argues that unlike in a headless society where dialogue is key, the WTO often resorts to sanctions. It's like their way of strong-arming developing countries into accepting trade deals that might not be in their best interests. He sees it as a form of economic coercion.
So instead of everyone coming to the table as equals, hashing things out through dialogue and finding a compromise, it's more like do this or else.
You hit the nail on the head. And Tandon argues that this approach, this my way or the highway attitude, has had a devastating impact on developing countries. It's hindering their ability to grow their economies on their own terms and chart their own destinies.
It's incredible how viewing international trade through this lens, Tandon's lens, can make it seem like a different kind of warfare. But is there any historical evidence to support this claim, or is it more of a theoretical framework? You mentioned historical evidence. Where does Tandon take us to illustrate this trade is war idea?
He dives straight into one of the most blatant examples in history, the Opium Wars of the 19th century.
Oh man, the Opium Wars. I remember learning about those. Didn't Britain force China to open its doors to opium trade?
Exactly. See, Britain had a massive trade deficit with China. They couldn't get enough of Chinese tea, silk, porcelain, all the good stuff. But China wasn't so keen on British goods, leading to an imbalance. To counter this, Britain decided to get China hooked on opium, which they were producing in India.
Talk about creating a market for your product. That's a whole new level of strategic manipulation.
It's a textbook example of how trade can be twisted into a weapon. The Opium Wars had devastating consequences for China. Not only did it lead to widespread addiction, but it also weakened the Chinese empire, forcing them to cede Hong Kong to Britain and opening the door for further exploitation by Western powers.
A chilling example for sure, and one that really highlights how a more powerful nation can use trade, or rather the manipulation of trade, to subjugate another. It's like Tandon's headless society analogy in action, where might makes right, and dialogue is replaced with coercion.
And it's not just ancient history. Tandon argues that these dynamics are still at play today, especially in the relationship between Europe and Africa.
Okay, tell me more about that. I know there's been a lot of talk about how European trade policies impact African nations.
Tandon uses his own experiences negotiating trade deals to illustrate this point. He argues that many African economies are still trapped in a system designed to benefit their former colonial masters. Even though these nations gained political independence decades ago, they remain economically dependent, exporting cheap raw materials and importing expensive finished goods.
So it's like they're stuck in this cycle of dependency, never really able to break free and build their own industries.
Exactly. Tandon compares it to the legacy of slavery, where even after abolition, former slaves might have been technically free, but remain bound by economic necessity and societal structures designed to keep them subservient. He says, and I quote, "The slave, the colonized nation, is made to feel indebted for meager preferences granted by the master."
Wow, that's a powerful image, trading one form's exploitation for another. It's like you're constantly running but never getting ahead, stuck in a system that's rigged against you from the start.
And that's where these economic partnership agreements, or EPAs, come into play.
EPAs, fill me in, what are those exactly?
Essentially, EPAs are trade agreements between the European Union and countries in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. On the surface, they're touted as a way to boost trade and development, but Tandon argues they're actually a form of economic warfare waged by the EU.
Hold on, how can something that's supposed to promote trade be harmful? Explain this like I'm just a guy who enjoys a good cup of coffee, which, by the way, probably originated from a country impacted by these very agreements.
Okay, let's break it down. Imagine your local coffee shop suddenly having to compete with a giant corporation selling coffee at ridiculously low prices because they get special treatment and subsidies. It wouldn't be a fair fight, right?
Definitely not. The local shop would probably be driven out of business.
That's what Tandon argues happens with EPAs. They often force developing countries to open their markets to a flood of cheap imports from the EU, undercutting local industries and farmers who can't compete with those prices.
So instead of helping these nations develop their own industries and become self-sufficient, these EPAs end up making them more dependent on European markets.
Exactly. It's like giving someone a loan with the fine print designed to keep them indebted forever. And Tandon saw this firsthand in Tanzania, where he witnessed the EU trying to push through an EPA that would have been devastating to the country's economy.
Sounds like a classic David versus Goliath situation. A massive economic powerhouse like the EU throwing its weight around and bullying smaller nations into accepting deals that might not be in their best interests.
That's precisely what Tandon observed. He talks about how difficult it was for countries like Tanzania to negotiate fair terms with the EU, which held all the cards in these negotiations.
So we've got these powerful nations and institutions using trade agreements as leverage to maintain their economic dominance. What's even more unsettling is that it's not just about physical goods, right? Tandon also digs into the world of knowledge and technology.
That's right. He dives into the murky waters of intellectual property rights.
Which, at first glance, sound like a good thing, right? Protecting inventions and ideas. But Tandon seems to have a different take.
He argues that while intellectual property rights can be important, they're often used by powerful corporations to control essential knowledge and technologies, particularly in agriculture and medicine.
Okay, so give me an example. How does this play out in the real world?
Well, what comes to mind for me is like genetically modified seeds.
Perfect example. Tandon talks about these corporations. Monsanto, for example, they own patents on these seeds. Farmers, they have to buy new seeds every year because they can't save seeds from crops grown with these genetically modified ones from Monsanto.
Yeah.
They're stuck, completely dependent on the corporation, often paying these crazy prices, all because of intellectual property rights.
So it's like they're trapped in this system with no way out. Exactly. And the thing is, it's not just limited to agriculture either. Tandon argues that these same principles apply to something even more crucial: life-saving medicines. Pharmaceutical companies, they use patents to control access to essential drugs, making them unaffordable, often, for people in developing countries, the very people who need them most.
It's like you're saying essential resources for survival, food, and medicine are being held hostage by these intellectual property rights.
That's exactly it. That's the heart of Tandon's argument. He believes that while these rights, sure, they can be important for fostering innovation, but they're so often used as just another weapon in this arsenal of economic warfare to maintain an unfair advantage in the global marketplace.
It's disheartening, to say the least. But are there any success stories? Any instances where developing nations have actually been able to push back against this and win?
There are, actually, and Tandon highlights a really inspiring case. India versus Novartis. So Novartis, huge pharmaceutical giant, they tried to patent a life-saving cancer drug in India. This patent would have given them exclusive rights to produce and sell this drug at, you guessed it, a premium price.
I can imagine that didn't go over too well, especially in a country where access to affordable medicine is critical for so many.
You're right, it didn't. The Indian government, along with a coalition of health activists, they fought tooth and nail. Their argument was that Novartis's patent claim was a blatant abuse of the system, plain and simple, because it was preventing people from accessing a drug that could save their lives.
David versus Goliath, right. So what happened? Did they actually win?
They did. It's a really landmark case, actually. India's Supreme Court, they ruled against Novartis, stating that the company's modifications to the drug, which were really quite minor, didn't hold up, didn't justify a brand new patent.
Wow.
This ruling was huge because it cleared the way for Indian companies to start producing and distributing generic versions of this drug at a fraction of the cost, making it accessible to countless people who were, up to that point, priced out.
And that's a victory worth celebrating. It shows it is possible to stand up to these pharmaceutical giants, these behemoths, and protect the well-being of citizens.
Absolutely. And you know what makes this case even more interesting? Novartis waited strategically for India to amend its patent law to comply with WTO regulations before they filed the lawsuit.
So they were playing the long game, using the very trade agreements that are supposed to level the playing field, manipulating them to their advantage.
Exactly. It just goes to show you the power imbalances baked into the global trade system, the very imbalances Tandon is fighting against.
This has been a pretty eye-opening look at international trade and, frankly, a bit disheartening. If things are as bleak as Tandon suggests, is there any hope for a more just and equitable system, or are we fighting a losing battle?
You know, for all his criticisms, Tandon doesn't strike me as someone who's given up hope, and neither should we. He really believes that change is possible, but it's going to require a seismic shift in how we think about and approach trade.
So what does that look like? What's the way forward?
He calls for what he describes as a nonviolent guerrilla warfare against the current system.
Guerrilla warfare. That sounds kind of intense. Is he saying we all need to storm the WTO headquarters?
Of course not. No need to get ourselves arrested. By guerrilla warfare, Tandon's advocating for a multifaceted approach. He emphasizes how crucial it is to challenge the dominant economic ideology, the one that always puts profits before people, and to build solidarity among developing nations so they can present a united front.
So fighting back, not with weapons and violence, but with ideas, with strategy, with collective action.
Exactly. He's urging developing countries to assert their right to prioritize their own development goals, their own people, and to resist the pressure to enter into trade agreements that could undermine their long-term interests, even if those pressures come from powerful nations. He's also a big proponent of exploring alternative models of production and exchange, things like fair trade and ethical consumption, just to name a few.
So it's about creating a system where trade isn't a zero-sum game, where everyone has the opportunity to benefit.
Exactly. And the best part is, he doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk. He talks about this time in Kenya when he and other activists were able to rally public support and pressure the EU to back down from a trade agreement that would have been really harmful, especially for Kenyan farmers.
That's amazing. It gives you a glimmer of hope, you know?
Yeah.
Even against these powerful entities, change is possible.
That's exactly the message Tandon leaves us with, a call to action. He reminds us that we all have a role to play in shaping a more just and equitable global trade system, whether that's choosing to buy fair trade products, holding our elected officials accountable for their stances on trade deals, or even just becoming more informed about these issues ourselves.
This deep dive has really challenged how I view international trade. It's such a complex issue with ripple effects that impact all of us. So where do we go from here? What's the final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
Tandon ends his book with a powerful question, one that takes us back to his childhood in Uganda. He asks, in a headless society, is the language of diplomacy preferable to that of sanctions?
Wow, that's a powerful question. It really makes you stop and think about what a world where global trade wasn't driven by self-interest and coercion, but by cooperation, by fairness, by a genuine desire for everyone to prosper would look like.
And that's a world worth fighting for. It's not going to be easy, but as Tandon's work so powerfully illustrates, it's a fight we can't afford to ignore.
It's been such an eye-opening deep dive, and I hope it sparked some critical thinking for all of you listening out there. If you're ready to explore these ideas further, and I really encourage you to do so, Check out Tandon's book, Trade is War. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.